Welcome to Dialed In on the Virtual Care Journey with Jeremy and Becca, your trusted companions in navigating the ever-evolving landscape of virtual care.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast, Dialed In on the Virtual Care Journey. I am Becca Bean, one of your hosts, also with Jeremy Hedrick. We're here to chat with you guys today, and we brought one of our good friends with us. This is Kris Virgin. Kris, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Kris Virgin. I've been working at with the Dial Care Group. I've been in compliance since 2007, and so I've got to experience just this journey from Dial Care in the physician network to the mental wellness network and to the dental network, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Great. So if you couldn't tell, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject today, compliance, following the rules.
It's what keeps you employed, right?
And keeps us out of trouble, right?
It does.
That's the most important.
It keeps us out of trouble. So the reality of what Kris's journey with us has really been since Dial Care was a concept, right? So when we first started talking about launching and building Dial Care and figuring out what does that landscape look like, right? So that's where we really started to engage Kris and his team, which are phenomenal folks there, to really dive in and say, what does it take, right? So I think today we'll cover several things today. We want to talk through kind of the regulatory aspect, right? So there's federal and state regulatory stuff that we'll dive into. We also want to talk about just the reality of what it takes from a compliance standpoint, your perspective on things like marketing materials, websites, things that we also have to be cognizant of, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but also just best practices and those types of things. And then probably talk through what we see happening out on the horizon, what COVID maybe did and how that maybe impacted compliance and various aspects of it, because we did see some shift throughout that time from a regulatory standpoint. So yeah, looking forward to diving in. Compliance can be fun. It may not.
They're always fun
if you do it correctly.
If you do it correctly.
If you do it correctly,
right. And if you have the right group of people around, right? Otherwise, it can be a little bit tough. So where do you want to jump in?
You know what? Let's start with a regulatory perspective. I think kind of how the laws that shape what we do is really important, and we can only have our product and be available based on the way state laws are written. And sometimes, I love regulators, and people that work in government, but they aren't necessarily career industry people in the industry that we work in. So writing law takes a village. It's not just the politician and their staffers. They get inputs from lots of businesses. So kind of want to talk through how we get engaged in that area and how the different laws kind of impact what we can and can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect point, that the regulators, the legislators, they're not subject matter experts on everything. So they take a lot of feedback from industry people on either side of the fence to better understand either legislation that's coming down or if they need to draft regulation. And so in the history of this, there was hesitancy to telehealth, as there was a fear that it was going to replace the brick and mortar physician. And so there was bills that you would see that were good, there were bills that you would see that were bad. And really when COVID hit, it changed everything because everything became virtual. And we saw people actually experience it. So we could tell people, hey, this is great. It doesn't replace the brick and mortar. It's just another tool in the toolkit to make sure that we're helping people get access to these services. And when COVID hit, it made sense to everyone. You didn't have to be a subject matter expert to know this is better. Whether you're a parent, you're trying to get your kid to see someone in the middle of the night, it's so convenient to be able to reach out, not have to put them in a car, not have to run to an emergency room, have that first conversation to make sure you understand what's going on. And so from that perspective, it's just been great on the legislative front for telehealth as we talk about physicians. It's been tremendous in the mental wellness space. Everyone's looking at it: psychologists, licensed professional counselors, social workers. Everything coming out is really positive. And so that's really one of the biggest pieces from compliance as we got into this, is it's such a vast mosaic of laws, whether it's federal laws, state laws, because we do have different healthcare professionals in the mental wellness network or the therapy network. We're looking at each of those state boards to understand what is the best practices for those licensed professionals.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, the medical board, the dental board, the counseling board, there's I think a lot within the mental health
Yes.
world, they have to work within the guidance of state law, and then federal trumps all of that, right? So how do they
Correct.
all work together?
Well, federal sets a baseline. So
Okay.
some states could go above and beyond that, but they at least have to meet that federal minimum. Typically what happens is the regulating boards, the medical board, the dental board, the mental wellness boards, they will work with the legislators if they think something needs to be pushed. And a lot of times that's where legislation comes from. And then it's important for us as a supplier of these services to make sure we're up to speed on it, and we can advise them if we feel like it's too restrictive or if it's reducing access. The most important thing for us in our mission statement is to make sure that we make these healthcare services accessible to everyone in all states.
So how do you, I think it's important to talk through, because I think because we've all worked together for so long and have done this since Dial Care was just a concept, but for other organizations out there, I think it's important for us to explore a couple things. One would be just how we work together in partnership, right? It's kind of, all kidding aside, there are organizations out there where I hear from other colleagues about how restrictive or narrow-minded or anti-business they feel their compliance teams can be.
Ours is not.
Ours is not. Thank you for the subtle, not so subtle
Thank you as well.
subtext.
You're welcome.
But the reality is I don't know how normal that is. And maybe some organizations, they work really well together. And I think in some cases it's maybe just colleagues and other people in the industry just venting because they want to do things or whatever. But so it's kind of a twofold thing I want you to hit on. One is how we've built that relationship, how you've built your team, and then how do you work to keep amongst your team, how do you work to keep all of this together? So we have state and federal, right? Federal's obviously a little easier because it's the overarching piece. Takes a little longer to do, easier to kind of jump on. But we have within the states, but then for us, like in our world, we've got the physician piece, dental piece, veterinary care, and mental health. And within mental health, there's several factions, right? So how do you guys work to keep all of those plates spinning? Because at any given session, in any given state, something can change. We're seeing that now. We've seen it practically every session across the country, some nuance. It'll get tucked into a different bill. They'll add language to a bill that we weren't tracking, and now we're faced with trying to figure out how do we comply. How do you guys manage all that? So one, how did you kind of work over the years to build that team, and then how did you get to a point where you're able to keep all these things
Yeah, and it's a great
balanced?
point, because compliance, the whole goal here is to reduce the risk for the entity, to make sure we've turned over every stone to figure out exactly how we can do this. But how we grew is because the compliance team was reporting to the CEO. So that gives you a different mindset, and that's really something you'll see between organizations is they don't have that same direct. They may report to legal, they may report to some other person, but by reporting to the CEO, you're a business section. You are helping us promote and push the business. And so that was great. That also gave us access to resources to make sure that we have enough people to help all those spinning plates. But also the important thing is really to just network with people in that same industry because you learn from their experience. We found associations are very helpful to build coalitions when we see there's problems that are going to limit access for the industry. But we also spend a lot of resources on just tracking bills. The federal, right, they're not really bipartisan right now, but this is usually something that is very bipartisan. So we see some traction at the federal level. Federal moves very slow, and that's on purpose because they don't want to make huge mistakes that they can't unwind. At the state level, there's so many legislations that have different schedules that you never know what state when it's going to be hot, it starts to pick up as you get close to the deadline, right? Deadlines make deals.
I was going to say, I think that is what's happening at the federal level right now. All the telehealth extensions that went into place because of COVID keep getting kicked down the road, and we now know that the current one's the end of this year, which is great during an election year, so it definitely won't get touched
right
beforehand, or at least that's the current thought.
And that's really what drove the bipartisan side of going through the public health emergency, having those PHE waivers last so long. It just gave access, and people liked it. The providers liked it because it was simpler for them. The patients liked it. And that's really where you have to start. You have to find a common ground and a good goal. We want to protect consumers as much as anyone, but we also want to make sure that the laws are fair for businesses to operate.
Yeah. So you hit on this a little bit, but I think it's important to talk about because I think it's such a needed aspect of this whole kind of broad topic of compliance. And that is coalition, constituent, however you want to phrase it, right? Who all is involved in that, right? So we've got other business partners that we compete with potentially from a product perspective. We may offer the same types of services, but we're aligned in our missions as far as increasing access, increasing the ability for these services to be offered virtually, especially against provider shortages. Mental health is just such a huge aspect of that. So there's other constituents and coalition building there, but there's also the boards where we have to get with the clinicians and say, hey, seemingly this bill looks like you're opposed to virtual health in this certain scenario. Can we talk about that, right? So there's the clinician side. There's obviously lobbyists that help us navigate that. There's a lot of different parties that we have to align with. Talk through a little bit of how we do that, especially most of that exists at a state level.
Right.
So to do that well, obviously not every state needs relationships at the same time.
Right.
So how do we navigate through that? What's our stance on that?
So how we do this is we're tracking bills in all 50 states. We read through them, we determine if we support them. If we support them, we watch them because they will get amended from time to time, and that amendment could be detrimental to what you do. And if we're not supportive of it and we oppose it, that's where we start looking at the coalition, start looking for lobbyists on the ground, because the most important thing in any state is to have someone local, because they're elected officials. They want to hear from their constituents, the people that can vote for them. If I go into Georgia and I say, hey, I'm from Texas, they're not interested in anything else I say after that. If I can't elect them, they don't really want to hear it. And so that's why it's important to have those lobbyists and have strong group support at that local level, because then you can explain it to them. They may not be a subject matter expert, but they really love their state and they love the people that vote for them.
Well, and it's two things, I think, on a state level also. It's being able to represent who's impacted within their state. It's the providers that are part of our network that this has become part of their source of income. And then it's also the constituents that they have, where it's very clearly this is one of the means of them getting health care. And if a regulation got put in place that would limit that health care, a lot of the times the legislatures aren't aware of how a way a bill is written can have those downstream impacts. So,
right. Limit it or take away what they've had.
Right.
The ability to use, right?
Right.
And so now it's even a deeper impact, right? Where you've been able to use this in totality, and now you're not going to be able to, and that's not.
And
ideal.
Becca hit on a perfect point. Is I've done a lot of lobbying in federal offices and state offices. The first question they ask is, how many people have your services in my district? You need to have that information handy, because it's going to be the first question they ask, because they want to know how important it is to their district on which side they vote.
Well, and that's one thing I've really enjoyed over our time kind of thinking through and then starting to build and launching DialCare and all of our different clinical services, is that our goal is to increase access for people. Right. It is not a controversial product. It's not a controversial topic. By and large, we're not in specialty care, we're not in high-risk care, we're not in things that I understand may need a little bit deeper look on it and nuance to make sure that every part of that equation is protected whether that be safety in the clinical services themselves or the clinical effectiveness and efficacy of the delivery model itself. You know, think back several years ago, probably even predates COVID, you know, hey, talk to a mental health professional just via text. And I'm not going to advocate one's good, better, whatever, but that was one of those that people would kind of say, okay, let's think about that a little bit more, because there's a delivery system there that in that world at that time, if I wanted to engage with a mental health professional, it was face-to-face by and large, 30 minutes or an hour-long session. And now to say, hey, you can just chat with somebody. At that point, there was probably a little bit more critical look on it than maybe there would be now. And again, I'm not here to say one's better or worse, but from our standpoint, our product, it's easy to go in and lobby. Lobbying sometimes can have a negative connotation just in the general population, depending on how you view it. And I've always been sensitive to that, because what I've loved the ability for us to do is that we have a product that really is just trying to address access, trying to free up space within these clinical practices to do more in-depth work that we would all say that needs to happen face-to-face, right?
Sure.
And so how do we do that? Especially, we're based in Texas. There's a lot of open rural areas in Texas where there's just flat out
There's nobody.
there's just deserts of clinicians, right? Nobody. And so to give somebody in that space the exact same access as somebody that lives in Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, same network of clinicians, same access to the exact same services, that gets exciting. So when we do sit down at these state houses or even at a federal level, there's a conviction we can bring to the equation that I think is a very honest one to bring, which is we're just trying to make sure everybody can get this, right? And so while you may be really trying to target one area that maybe needs to be talked about, maybe even regulated, let's not lump everything into one bucket, because we're not all created the same way, kind of thing. So how we navigate that has really been interesting to me.
And I just love that we've got such a great team that just is proactive about it. I think it's important when you find a partner internally at your company, or if you're looking for someone to partner with on for any type of business, you want to know that you're with someone who is paying attention and cares about kind of what the legislative impact is. Do we have anything else you want to add on a state or federal level before maybe we dive into some of the business side?
So the one thing I would say, and this goes back to where we started, is, you know, our compliance team is really good, but it's only good because of our stakeholders, because we can read a bill, but we're not subject matter experts on everything. And that's why you have to have that open line of communication with the stakeholders, so they can give you the things that they feel are problematic or would be difficult operationally. And that's how we know when it's time to activate, get involved, make sure that we have boots on the ground, and we're not opposed to regulation or legislation as long as it protects the consumer and it's fair.
Yeah, and I think one thing we haven't hit on before we pivot to some of the marketing stuff is also, because I love what you said, but I think there's an element of needing to be that kind of voice in the industry and partner to other companies and other delivery models and systems, even when we're not facing a regulatory thing. Right? Just because we believe in what we're doing in a state. So even if there's not, yes, our efforts have to be different when there is some kind of regulatory hurdle for us to overcome. Thank you. See, that's what happens when we work together, everybody. We can fill in each other's words that we drop. And in that, I think, too, what I've loved over the years is we try to be that voice, even when there's not maybe a big ticket hurdle for us to be fighting for or against, right? Hey, we want to be active in these states because we believe in the services that we're offering. And so how do we become good partners, even though we aren't based there? We can only be based in one state, right? It's our home state here. So that to me is also an interesting approach that we've taken. I think that comes through our presence in associations, whether those be state or federal, or business line specific, whether that's TPA specific or telemedicine specific. And I think that can get overlooked too, is, hey, a lot of this work just takes us constantly being around and in the market, right? Right.
And that you touched on, lobbying may not be a great word, but it's all network building. So it's everything in the business lines. we, fight with our competitors all the time, but we also have the same mission. And
Right.
that's something you can't lose sight of, and you never want to burn a bridge, but having that network, it's great because they also look to you for guidance and expertise on battles you've already gone through.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we're going to kind of jump from the state and federal, which is always so much fun, to talk about laws and how that works. I always get that, the I'm Just a Bill song with the little guy
Absolutely.
written in.
Yes.
The sad part is there's a whole element of people that don't know what you're talking about, and that makes me sad.
But I do, so once a
Or
year.
have those
They
stood
still
the
have
test
to
of
show that in
time?
school, right?
No.
I'm just
Oh,
a
I don't
Bill.
think so.
Our
Once a
our
year.
production
Kris
team's
said
nodding
no.
their head. Great, and they're
What, the nodding your head, yes or no?
yes.
Seriously? Okay,
Sorry.
then I.
So
that-
once a year, I have my
Thank you,
compliance
Schoolhouse
team
Rock.
watch it in our team meeting. Just
Okay,
it's
that
kinda
might be
funny.
the best thing I've heard.
It's
The
kinda
compliance
cheesy,
team has
but
to watch
it.
it.
Makes it fun, right? Like, this.
Are we going to have to pay somebody that we just endorsed this thing?
I
don't
don't
think
think so.
If so, I think it might be worth it.
And
That
now
was
I'll be
maybe
singing
worth
that
it.
song for the rest of our
I'm just a
discussion,
Bill.
just in my head. So
So as we pivot, we're going to talk a little bit about how compliance also does a great job of making sure the programs that we offer are marketed correctly. When we sell to a client, it's our responsibility to ensure that how even a reseller, another partner,
Absolutely.
is also marketing that program correctly. So I know people kind of always joke you come in and have to be the bad guys, like, don't say that, please.
Right.
But can you walk through kind of the importance of it and what could happen if we didn't put that level in?
Sure, and it goes back to, again, protecting the consumer. It's about making sure the messaging is correct, it's not misleading. And just to take a step back and just think through the compliance of it all, it goes back to you have to start from the beginning where you have to understand the corporate practice of medicine, the corporate practice of dentistry, just so you know how to set up your companies, arrange them, make sure that you're properly licensed or registered in everywhere you plan on doing business. And then you have to dive into those state laws to understand what is required in each state because they're all different, right?
Yeah.
So there's an argument against having a federal versus the 50 state. They're both really tough because they both bring a lot of different things to the table. But what our team did is really dive into all the aspects and components in the state level, whether it's informed consent, understanding the age of consent, because we do have a product that focuses on student mental wellness. And then you look and make sure that the physicians understand it. And that's where it's important that you're working with a really strong medical director or dental director because they understand it. They have the same passion and they're coming from the provider side. So you have to walk through it with them to make sure you're giving your professionals, healthcare professionals, the roadmap on how to do this correctly.
Yep.
And then once you've kind of established that, it's then how do you then present that to market, to share with different employers or other opportunities. And the key is always to make sure it's not misleading. When we first started talking about this, there was a lot of concern that people felt telehealth was going to replace brick and mortar. And so we have to be very conscious of the fact that they understand what telehealth's role is.
Yeah.
And
it's not that.
It's not that,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
you have to get that message across. And we see marketing sometimes where that message is a little fuzzy. And we just want to put that in focus to make sure that not only are our resellers putting out the right message, but it's setting the right expectation for the consumer, because that's where you get consumer complaints if they thought they bought one thing and then when they use it, it's a completely different experience.
So I will never be allowed to say from compliance, telemedicine is the best form of healthcare
No,
ever.
absolutely not. But
It
thank
might
you
have
for
been the
doing
best
that.
thing that happened during COVID to make sure people were able to
Absolutely
be
was.
seen. But it's in those nuanced words where they can kind of go, hey, maybe you should rephrase it this way. I always joke when someone does a press release about something like, we're the first that ever has done this. And then you can be like, but Google just told me that you were like third or fourth, but you way to go that you got the first.
Yes.
Right.
So wording matters.
You know, there's another piece. You know, we talked earlier about kind of constituents in this game, and you hit on one that we left out back then. While it's not while they're not an aspect of your compliance team proper, I don't want to forget about our clinical directors and our QA teams that are all clinical, even credentialing teams that are based on that's comprised of all clinicians, because that is a component of, there's times we've had regulation where we're like, I don't know what our real thought is on this, because from a business only standpoint, we would still be able to do X, Y, and Z, right? But we've had to get that to our clinical director and our committees to say, from a professional standpoint though, from a pure clinical standpoint, what's your interpretation or thought on this, your reaction to this language or this assumption that is guiding that language, right? Which is a key component that we don't need it all the time, but we've seen our fair share of regulation that comes up that we're like, there's a clinical aspect to this. Then that's above all of our pay grades. That's just not what we are. And so to have a really tight relationship with our clinical directors like we do and our committees has been another, I would say, part of that overall compliance effort, if you will.
And that brings up a great point. The compliance diving in is not only are we looking at the telehealth components, but we're also looking at the professional licensing components, because the providers that we're recruiting to join the network and provide the services, there's states where they have to have a special permit or they have to register, and we want to make sure we're aware of that, so we're keeping our healthcare professionals compliant as well.
Yeah, there's so that, but then there's also business operations. It's not just marketing, it's, hey, this state requires, it's one thing to tell us, it's another component of what your team does. It's one thing to tell us, hey, in this state, audio needs to be the only mechanism or video has to be first or whatever. There's little nuances across that. It's then making sure that we actually put systems in place to do that.
Systematically. We got to make sure it's not left to human error to inadvertently go against regulation.
Right, or just to tell us and then hope we do it. Like there's a component of oversight that we need, because things can get busy and
that goes back to the communication and making sure it's a two-way street. That we tell you something, but if you don't understand it, you're not going to be able to do anything with it.
Yeah, companies that don't work compliance as a partnership,
I don't know how they function.
I don't either, or how they. Some will just have it as its own little untouchable island, and I've never quite. I get why we want them a little bit walled off. You kind of need impartiality and just focus on it. Same thing probably with IT security. Like, hey, I love what you guys are trying to do, but this just has a problem, and we can't do it this way. We have to do other things. You need that, impartiality. But it is such. We've just always been, lucky that we've set it up from the beginning. Had leaders like you that have just made that. Hey, we're part of the team that makes this stuff happen, right? We're not here to be the afternoon storm cloud that says no to everything, right? Like, can't do it, right? It's not going to be there. But that team of just trusting that what you're bringing up, we need to help jump in and fight and take the lead on, has been great.
Yeah, I think it's one thing also, just know that every single page, piece, word has been thought through from a compliance and legal perspective to make sure we're covered. So we are very fortunate to have such a wonderful team, and Kris charges that group and is just
and I think too it's never a one and done proposition.
No.
Right? Like we I don't know when we rebranded, we revamped our whole website a year or two ago at Lose Track.
Just ask me what we call a session versus a visit versus a consult is very nuanced, and he's laughing because I think we spent hours debating
words
what
matter.
words
matter.
It was
but the reality of that is
it's worth it. It makes sure that we are all very confident that what we're putting out into the marketplace is accurate.
But the challenge, or one of the challenges, is it's accurate as of today. 6 months from now, we may have a state or two that do something that, while it doesn't impact our ability to do business there the way we always have, it does impact the wording we may need to use or add, or it may impact an informed consent, or a new disclosure that we need to add, or a new parental consent we need to get. The age may have changed in a state or something. And so while it doesn't impact what we go through all of that time to build, at that moment in time, it's great. And so part of this is always then, do we need to take a retro look at what we have, which is where it gets really crazy, right? Because at some point, that domino trail is very, very long of things we have to check. For something that we would all say is a pretty simple change. It's not a business impacting one, but it is a compliance impacting one. And the words matter, and so we have to go back and find all the places we've used certain things.
I feel like every English teacher across the country is just like cheering us on right now for saying words matter
Words do
so
matter.
many times, and all the vocab lessons that they had to go through.
Right. Yeah. We do love the games of like, well, what other word can we use? Like, what can we use? That's
We'll put together a long list, and that's always been important from my perspective from compliance. Is your first reaction shouldn't be no. It should be, how do we find a solution that meets the need?
Right.
And that's really how I have all my people look at a problem, is if we know this is problematic, how do we get to a solution that works and still keeps the intent that the business owners wanted?
Yep, that's a good point.
Well, compliance is always just a ton of fun. I feel like anyone who hasn't had the chance to work with you directly just got to learn so much today about what compliance does for an organization, how it impacts us as a business and as an industry. So thank you for coming in and giving us so much more insight into your team.
Thank you all for having me.
Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Like how great we are.
You are great.
You're our first guest, so you got to tell people it's
set
worth
the bar
coming
high,
back.
man.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. I definitely will. Appreciate being in the
We're
podcast.
good hosts.
Have a
We ate
great
lunch
view
before.
here.
We fed people.
Ate lunch. I think the one thing is, so we have challenges that we're working through today that we need to have boots on the ground, and we need to be involved. And the reason is because right now, a lot of the telehealth vendor space isn't regulated. It's regulated through the services themselves. But I think that's probably because legislators and regulators, they're usually 5 to 10 years behind industry trends. So I would anticipate they start looking at some of these telehealth vendors. And if you've built your plan correctly and you've had heavy involvement from compliance, you're going to be in a great space when you start to see that type of legislation. So it's important to think about where this could go in the future to make sure you're best in class.
I was about to say, and this is a rabbit hole for another episode, but compliance and healthcare and AI is just a huge topic that at some point we'll have to unpack.
Let's solve
here.
that one right now.
I was
Let's
about
talk
to say,
about
it's the hot topic at every conference, AI and
Absolutely.
healthcare.
But for a good reason.
Yes,
AI.
I think it scares a lot of people, and there's a lot of things that can be done well with it, and a lot of things that
Absolutely.
are gonna get shot down and probably be regulated. I will not be shocked if that's a topic that we're gonna have to have you back on for at some point.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well,
Thanks, Kris.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thanks everyone for joining us on Dialed In, the Virtual Care Journey. We really appreciate you spending some of your valuable minutes with us today.
right.
You can find our podcast anywhere you enjoy listening to podcasts.
That's right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
you.
you.